Brooklyn never sleeps, but on this night, it watched in silence. Under the glow of streetlights and traffic signals, a familiar name from millions of childhood memories took her final steps, unnoticed by the city that rushed past her. Kianna Underwood, once a Nickelodeon child star, once a face associated with laughter and bright studio lights, was struck on a Brooklyn street, and the driver disappeared into the dark. How does someone vanish in a neighborhood lined with cameras? Why did help not arrive in time? And what actually happened in the final hours before her life ended, hours that, even now, remain fragmented by missing footage, unanswered calls, and an investigation still searching for its first arrest? There is the collision itself. That is the headline. But there is also the quiet build-up, the hours before the impact, the decisions made, the paths crossed and not crossed, the small details that rarely make it into breaking news alerts. Tonight, we slow time down. We return to the final 24 hours of Kianna Underwood's life, tracing the last movements of a former child star whose death reopened old questions about fame, anonymity, and how easily someone can disappear, even in the middle of a crowded city. The news did not break with spectacle. There was no press conference at dawn, no official photograph circulated across television screens. Instead, the story surfaced quietly, first through police reports, then through short headlines that many readers scrolled past without recognizing the name. But for a certain generation, the name landed differently. Kianna Underwood was not a global superstar, not a chart-topping celebrity whose every move had been documented in real time. She was something more intimate and, in many ways, more fragile, a remembered face from childhood television. A reminder of afternoons spent in front of the screen, of laughter engineered in brightly lit studios, of a time when the world felt simpler. When outlets began identifying her as a former Nickelodeon child actress from All That, the reaction shifted. Social media slowed down, then surged. Posts multiplied. Old clips resurfaced. Fans shared screenshots from episodes they had not thought about in years. The shock was not just that someone had died, it was that someone who belonged to a shared past had vanished without warning. The details were sparse. A hit and run in Brooklyn. Late night or early morning hours. Pronounced dead at the scene. No suspect in custody. Each update raised more questions than answers. In a city saturated with surveillance cameras, how could a driver simply disappear? In a neighborhood that never truly empties, how could no one intervene in time? The absence of information became its own story, fueling frustration and disbelief. Comment sections filled with the same refrains: how is this possible? Why hasn't anyone been arrested? Why does it feel like this is already being forgotten? Media coverage oscillated between two tones. Some outlets treated the story as a tragic but routine traffic fatality, another statistic in a long list of urban hit-and-runs. Others framed it as something more unsettling, a former child star, removed from the spotlight, dying anonymously on a public street. That contrast struck a nerve. There was an uncomfortable symbolism in the way the story unfolded. A woman once protected by studio gates, production schedules, and adult handlers now stood alone in the open city, vulnerable in a way that fame had never truly prepared her for. The transition from public figure to private citizen, so often romanticized, suddenly looked stark and unforgiving. For many viewers, this was no longer just about a single incident. It became a broader conversation about what happens after the applause fades. About how easily people slip out of collective memory. About how former child stars navigate adulthood without the safety nets the public assumes they have. And beneath all of it, the unanswered core remained. Not who Kianna Underwood had been, but what, exactly, had happened to her in the hours leading up to that collision. What path had brought her to that street at that moment? And why, days later, the city still had no one to hold accountable. To understand those final hours, the story has to rewind, far past the flashing lights of Brooklyn, back to the beginning of a life that entered the spotlight long before it was ready to leave it. Long before Brooklyn streets and police reports, Kianna Underwood's life unfolded under a very different kind of light. She entered the entertainment world young enough that the routines of adulthood were replaced by call sheets, studio rehearsals, and adults making decisions on her behalf. When she appeared on All That, she became part of a carefully constructed machine designed to turn children into symbols of joy. The sets were colorful. The laughter was loud. The audience was millions strong. From the outside, it looked like success arrived early and effortlessly. But childhood fame has a way of compressing time. Milestones blur. Growing up happens in public, and mistakes, small, human mistakes, are preserved forever in reruns and online clips. For Kianna, the role was never just about performing, it became an identity assigned before she had the chance to choose one herself. As Nickelodeon moved forward, so did its programming. New faces replaced old ones. Seasons ended. Shows concluded. For viewers, it was a natural cycle. For the children inside that cycle, it often felt like a sudden disappearance. Kianna's transition out of the spotlight was quiet. There were no farewell specials or public reinventions. Like many former child actors, she faced a crossroads familiar but rarely discussed openly: how to become an adult when the world knows you as a child. Auditions became fewer. Roles changed. The industry that once welcomed her began to feel distant, then opaque. Fame did not vanish overnight, it dissolved slowly, leaving behind expectations without guarantees. The attention faded, but the pressure did not. Friends and acquaintances would later describe a woman trying to define herself outside of a character she once played. Someone navigating adulthood without the structure that had once dictated every hour of her day. In public, she was often invisible. Privately, she carried the weight of a past that people remembered more vividly than she did. This phase of life, the one between recognition and obscurity, is rarely documented. There are no highlight reels for it. But it is here, in the long middle stretch, that many former child stars struggle the most. Financial uncertainty. Shifting relationships. The quiet realization that childhood success does not guarantee adult stability. For Kianna, this period shaped everything that came later. It was not a single failure or dramatic collapse. It was a slow recalibration. A life moving forward without a clear map. And like so many who leave fame early, she learned to live without the protection of constant attention, without realizing how exposed that could make her. Years passed. The public stopped watching. The world moved on. And yet, every step she took afterward was connected, subtly, invisibly, to those early years in the spotlight. The expectations, the loss of structure, the distance between who she had been and who she was trying to become. By the time Kianna reached her early 30s, the camera was no longer on her. But the story was still unfolding. And beneath the surface of a quiet adult life, there were pressures, adjustments, and vulnerabilities that would only become visible when everything came to an abrupt stop. To understand why her final weeks unfolded the way they did, the story must look closer, at the fractures that develop when early fame fades, and at the shadows that grow when a life is lived mostly off-screen. In the weeks leading up to her death, Kianna Underwood's life did not appear extraordinary. There were no public announcements, no dramatic changes visible from the outside. And yet, when investigators and reporters later tried to reconstruct her final movements, a pattern emerged, not of chaos, but of quiet displacement. She was moving through the city more frequently. Changing locations. Spending time alone. According to available reports, Kianna had been living largely outside the public eye, navigating day-to-day life without the infrastructure that once surrounded her. No entourage. No assistants. No tightly controlled schedule. Just a woman in her early 30s, moving through Brooklyn like millions of others, anonymous, unprotected, and unremarked upon. Those close to her would later say there was nothing that suggested imminent danger. No explicit cries for help. No statements that hinted at fear or distress. If anything, her behavior appeared subdued. Normal. And that normalcy is what made the tragedy so difficult to process afterward. In the days before the incident, Kianna followed familiar routines. She walked. She took public routes. She occupied public spaces where safety is often assumed, not guaranteed. There is no evidence that she believed she was at risk that night. No indication that she sensed she was walking toward her final hours. This is where hindsight becomes deceptive. After a death, every detail is reinterpreted as a possible sign. Every movement becomes suspicious. But at the time, nothing about Kianna's actions stood out. She was not behaving recklessly. She was not fleeing something visible. She was simply living. What stands out now is how unremarkable the days before her death seemed. The absence of warning signs did not mean the absence of vulnerability. It meant that vulnerability had become normalized, woven into everyday life so tightly that it was no longer recognizable as danger. In urban environments like Brooklyn, people often move under the assumption that visibility equals safety. That being surrounded by others provides protection. That cameras, streetlights, and traffic create accountability. That assumption would prove tragically fragile. As the final day approached, there were no known plans that would mark it as different. No scheduled meetings that would later be canceled. No recorded phone calls that would be replayed in documentaries. If Kianna spoke to anyone that day, those conversations have not been publicly detailed. If she sent messages, they have not been released. What is clear is this: by the time the night arrived, she was alone. And when the final hours began to slip away, the city around her continued as usual, cars moving, lights changing, people passing by, unaware that a life once shaped by television audiences was approaching its abrupt end on an ordinary street. The final 24 hours of Kianna Underwood's life would not be defined by spectacle. They would be defined by silence. What can be known about the final 24 hours of Kianna Underwood's life comes from fragments. Official timelines. Police statements. News reports released after the fact. There is no diary of her last day, no recorded farewell, no clear narrative written in advance. What exists is a narrowing corridor of time, hours that quietly closed in. On the final day, Kianna moved through Brooklyn without drawing attention. There were no reports of erratic behavior, no signs of confrontation, no indication that she was being followed or threatened. To the city around her, she was just another pedestrian. Another presence blending into the background of traffic, storefronts, and late-night movement. As daylight faded, Brooklyn shifted into its familiar nocturnal rhythm. Cars filled the streets. Music spilled from open doors. Pedestrians crossed intersections without looking twice at one another. It is within this ordinary setting that the extraordinary occurred. At some point during the night, details remain limited and deliberately cautious in public reporting, Kianna was struck by a vehicle. The impact was sudden. Violent enough to be fatal. And then, just as suddenly, the driver fled. There was no pause. No attempt to render aid. No moment of hesitation captured in official statements. The vehicle disappeared into traffic, leaving behind a body on the street and a scene that would soon draw flashing lights and police tape. Emergency responders arrived, but the window for survival had already closed. Kianna was pronounced dead at the scene. The time between impact and medical confirmation was brief, yet definitive. By the time authorities took control of the area, the central figure of the story was already gone. What followed was confusion. Witness accounts, if any, were incomplete. In some hit-and-run cases, there are descriptions of headlights, colors, partial license plates. In this case, public details were scarce. Police confirmed the nature of the incident but withheld specifics, citing an ongoing investigation. The absence of information became its own form of noise. In a neighborhood dense with surveillance cameras, traffic cams, storefront security systems, residential door cameras, the lack of immediate leads felt impossible to reconcile. Questions surfaced almost instantly. Was footage missing? Had cameras failed? Were angles obstructed? Or had the vehicle simply passed through blind spots no one realized existed? Official sources did not speculate. They emphasized process. Evidence collection. Review of available footage. Appeals for witnesses. But for those watching from the outside, the timeline felt incomplete. A life had ended in public space, yet the responsible party had evaporated. In the hours immediately after her death, Kianna's name was not yet trending. The scene was processed. The street reopened. Traffic resumed. The city continued forward, largely unaware that a former child star's final moments had unfolded on its pavement. It was only later, when her identity became public, that the weight of those final hours began to register. The realization that someone once known by millions had spent her last moments unrecognized, unattended, and unprotected. The final 24 hours did not contain dramatic twists or visible warning signs. They were marked instead by how quickly life can end in the absence of attention, and how easily responsibility can slip away when no one is forced to stop. And as investigators began their work, a new phase of the story emerged, one defined not by what happened, but by what had not yet been answered. In the days that followed, the story of Kianna Underwood shifted from tragedy to investigation. Police classified the incident as a fatal hit-and-run and confirmed that the driver had fled the scene. Detectives began retracing the route around the collision site, canvassing nearby businesses and residential buildings, requesting surveillance footage, and asking anyone who might have been in the area that night to come forward. Publicly, details remained limited. Authorities did not immediately release a description of the vehicle. No suspect image circulated in the early days. There were no press conferences promising imminent arrests. Instead, there were short statements emphasizing that the case was active and ongoing. For many observers, that restraint felt unsettling. Brooklyn is one of the most surveilled urban environments in the country. Traffic cameras monitor intersections. Stores record sidewalks. Apartment buildings log every entrance and exit. The assumption, widely held, rarely questioned, is that someone, somewhere, always sees everything. Kianna Underwood's case challenged that assumption. As media coverage expanded, questions multiplied. How could a driver strike someone and disappear without leaving an immediate trail? Was footage unavailable, unusable, or still under review? Had witnesses failed to realize what they had seen? Or had they simply kept moving, assuming someone else would stop? Police did not speculate publicly, but experts familiar with hit-and-run investigations pointed out uncomfortable realities. Cameras do not cover every angle. Footage can be overwritten. Nighttime glare, speed, and weather can distort images. And in dense traffic, a vehicle can vanish in seconds. Still, the absence of early breakthroughs fed frustration. Fans and commentators expressed anger not only at the unknown driver, but at the broader system that allowed such a disappearance to feel possible. Online discussions turned toward accountability, about urban safety, about pedestrian vulnerability, about how often hit-and-run cases remain unresolved. For Kianna's family and those who knew her, the waiting became its own form of trauma. Grief unfolded alongside uncertainty. Without an arrest, there was no closure. Without answers, every update felt provisional. The story also reopened a familiar tension in public discourse: when does a case receive sustained attention, and when does it quietly fade? Some questioned whether Kianna's status as a former child star, recognizable but no longer famous, placed her in an uneasy middle ground, visible enough to be mourned, but not enough to command prolonged investigative spotlight. No official conclusions were announced in the immediate aftermath. The investigation continued, methodically and without spectacle. Leads were evaluated. Tips were logged. The city waited. And as days turned into weeks, the most unsettling aspect of the case remained unchanged: a person had died in a public place, and the one responsible was still unknown. The unanswered questions lingered, not just about the mechanics of the collision, but about what it revealed. About how anonymity can return suddenly, even to those once known. About how fragile safety can be when responsibility is optional. The investigation was ongoing. The silence, unresolved. And with no definitive ending, the story began to move toward its final phase, not one of answers, but of reflection. When the noise fades, what remains is not the collision itself, nor the headlines that briefly carried her name. What remains is a question that feels uncomfortably close to home: how does someone once known by millions leave the world unseen? Kianna Underwood's legacy does not live in box office numbers or awards. It lives in memory, in reruns watched after school, in jokes remembered decades later, in the strange intimacy audiences feel toward people they never truly knew. She represented a moment in time when joy was simple and television felt safe. And that is precisely why her final hours feel so dissonant. Her death exposed a harsh truth about life after fame. Applause does not follow you forever. Protection does not come standard. When the spotlight moves on, it leaves behind human beings who must navigate the same dangers as everyone else, sometimes with fewer supports than the public imagines. There is no confirmed ending to her story yet. The investigation remains open. The driver has not been named. Accountability has not been assigned. And perhaps that unresolved state is part of the legacy itself, a reminder that closure is not guaranteed, even in a world obsessed with documentation. Looking back at Kianna's life from its final moments forces a shift in perspective. This is no longer just a story about a hit and run. It is about visibility and invisibility. About how easily a life can slip between systems designed to notice everything. About how childhood fame can echo long after the cameras stop rolling, shaping vulnerability in ways few anticipate. In the end, Kianna Underwood did not leave behind a final message or a public goodbye. What she left instead was a pause, a silence that asks the rest of us to look more closely at who we protect, who we forget, and what responsibility truly means in shared spaces. Her final hours may remain incomplete in official records. But the questions they raise will linger far longer than the night she disappeared into the dark.